Welcome to Countarts. Here we're going to look at the differences between a full invoice and an abridged invoice. Now, it is important to know the difference between a full tax invoice and an abridged tax invoice, especially for tax purposes. Now, if you're receiving invoices for your expenses as a company or even as an individual, now you usually don't pay attention to the details or it doesn't really matter much. But if you're going to declare this as expenses, when SARS or the Revenue Authority asks you to upload supporting documentation, you must make sure that it's according to their requirements. And there's a difference between a full invoice and an abridged invoice. And this is also according to the South African Revenue Service. This is most important for those who are registered as VAT vendors. If you are registered as a VAT vendor, we know that you will be collecting VAT on behalf of SARS and you'll be paying over that amount to SARS, but you'll also be claiming the VAT that you would have paid on your expenses. So you need to make sure that you are claiming on invoices for which you have the invoice as required by SARS. Now, we've done another lesson where we went through VAT registration and what are the pros and cons and what you need to consider. You'll find the link to that lesson in the description below. But here we'll quickly look at just the invoices. The most important document on claiming input VAT is the tax invoice, as I've just mentioned. If a tax invoice does not meet the requirements according to the Revenue Authority, you are not permitted to claim the input VAT for that particular tax invoice. If you do, there are serious penalties you may incur. That is when they ask you for supporting documents and they realize that you have claimed for a specific expense, even though it's a genuine expense. If you don't have the invoice as per the requirements according to the Revenue Authority, then you will incur penalties. Now, one thing to note is that SARS requires that a tax invoice must be issued within 21 days from the time the supply was made. So if you are the one who is the supplier and you're supplying products or goods or services to your customers, you need to make sure that you do supply them with an invoice within 21 days. And even you as a client, you need to make sure that you request the tax invoice from your suppliers within 21 days. They need to supply you with this. So you need to ensure that is the case. You are required to issue a full tax invoice when the price is more than 5,000 Rand, and the 5,000 Rand is VAT inclusive, all right? So if the amount inclusive of VAT is greater than 5,000 Rand, then you need to provide a full tax invoice. This is referred to as the consideration of the supplier. You may issue an abridged tax invoice when the consideration for the supply is 5,000 Rand or less than 5,000 Rand. And remember, it has to be inclusive of VAT. So if the total amount inclusive of VAT is 5,000 Rand or less, then you can issue an abridged tax invoice or you can receive an abridged tax invoice, and that would be fine with SARS. If the consideration for the supply is 50 Rand or less, a tax invoice is not required, so it doesn't have to be a full tax invoice or an abridged tax invoice. However, a document such as a till slip or a sales docket indicating the VAT charged by the supplier will be required to verify the input tax deducted. So if the amount is 50 Rand or less and I'm claiming the input VAT on that expense, I need to make sure that I have at least a receipt or a slip, all right, that you will have received. It doesn't have to necessarily be a tax invoice. Now let's look at the full tax invoice. What is included in a full tax invoice, or what is required? Well, this is required where the supply including VAT exceeds 5,000 Rand. I've already mentioned that. So the first requirement is that it must contain the words tax invoice, VAT invoice, or invoice somewhere. All right, so you will see this on top of the invoice and it will be large enough for you to see it. So that's very important. It must contain those words: tax invoice, VAT invoice, or invoice. All right, so you cannot use a delivery note, for instance. If it's written delivery note on top, you can't use that as an invoice and provide that to the Revenue Authority. They will decline it. All right, so you need to make sure it's written tax invoice or VAT invoice or invoice. The second requirement here is that the name, address, and VAT registration number of the supplier needs to be on the invoice. Okay, so if your supplier is giving you the invoice and you can see their name is there, their address is there, but their VAT registration number is not there, you need to ask your supplier to correct that. All right, you need an invoice with their VAT registration number as well, because you can't use that invoice and claim the input VAT, because if you ask for supporting documents and they see that the supplier details are not complete, then you should not have claimed input VAT on that particular invoice. So that's very important. The third one here is that the name, address, and where the customer is registered for VAT, the customer's VAT registration number. So if you are claiming for input VAT, obviously you must be registered for VAT. Then your name, address, and VAT registration number also needs to appear on that invoice. And this is very important because when we're dealing with clients, we'll see that they will give us invoices to do the VAT schedules, and you'll find that the customer details or their own details are not complete. Usually their VAT registration number is not in that invoice. You need to give your supplier your VAT registration number so that they can include it on all your invoices. All right, so you need to make sure your name, your address, and your VAT registration number appears on it. The fourth one here is the serial number or the invoice number, and the date of issue of the invoice appears on the invoice as well. So this is usually the invoice number. It needs to have that number and the date of issue. The fifth one here is it must have an accurate description of goods and or services, indicating where applicable that the goods are second-hand goods. Very important. If the goods are second-hand goods, it must be indicated, but it must also have a description of the goods or services that were supplied. All right. The sixth one we have here is that quantity or volume of goods or services supplied needs to be indicated. So if your supplier sold you 5 chairs, it needs to indicate that there are 5 chairs which were sold to you. It can't just have the total amount. It must indicate the volume or quantity of goods or services. The seventh one we have here is that the value of the supply, which is the amount excluding VAT, the amount of the tax charged, which is the tax amount or the VAT amount, and the consideration of the supply, which is the amount inclusive of VAT, needs to be indicated on that invoice. So you usually see that where it says the amount excluding VAT, it shows you the amount, it shows you the VAT amount, and it shows you the amount inclusive of VAT. So those are very important details that need to appear. And this is what constitutes a full invoice. All right. So if it doesn't have all these details, then it's not a full invoice. And remember, if the consideration of the supply or the amount inclusive of VAT is greater than 5,000 Rand, it needs to contain all these 7 items. Okay, so you need to ensure that's the case. What about abridged invoice? Well, let's quickly look at that. This is required where the supply, including VAT, exceeds 50 Rand and less than 5,000 Rand. All right, so if it's 5,000 Rand or less and it's more than 50 Rand, you can issue an abridged invoice. But a full tax invoice as well can be issued, all right, instead of an abridged. So if you have a full invoice, even though the consideration of the supply is 5,000 Rand or less, that is perfectly fine. In fact, we always tell our clients that you should prefer that your suppliers should issue you with full tax invoices all the time. All right, so that you don't run into that problem where the consideration for the supply or the amount inclusive of VAT is more than 5,000 Rand, but they've just issued you with an abridged invoice. All right, you'll need a full invoice if the amount is greater than 5,000 Rand. That is why we always tell our clients just ensure that you're issued the full tax invoice just to avoid those issues or those problems. But if the amount is 5,000 Rand or less, then that's fine. You can get an abridged invoice. What is included there? Well, the first one here, it must include tax invoice, VAT invoice, or invoice. So you can see it's the same as the full tax invoice requirement number 1. The second one, name, address, and VAT registration number of the supplier needs to be indicated on the invoice. The third one is the serial number or invoice number, and the date of issue of the invoice needs to be indicated. The fourth one, it must have an accurate description of the goods. And the fifth one here is the value of the supply, which is the VAT exclusive amount, the amount of tax charged, and the consideration of the supply, which is the VAT inclusive amount, needs to be indicated. So all these must be in place for it to be considered an abridged invoice. So you can note here that your details as the client or as the customer does not need to be on the invoice. If the amount is 5,000 Rand or less, then if your details are not appearing on the invoice, that's fine. As long as it has at least these 5 things on the invoice, it will be acceptable. I hope that has made sense. I hope you now know the difference between a full tax invoice and an abridged invoice. And like I said, you'd prefer that you are always issued with a full tax invoice so that you know all is in order. All right, so that you don't always have to look at the amount and then check that it meets the requirements. If you've gained value from this, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Till next time, cheers.